Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Yasmin. I'm, as Ruth said, the Digital Engagement and Community Outreach Officer at the library, and we're one of the we're one of the world's leading and most extensive archives on the Holocaust, the Nazi era, and genocide. And the library hosts a unique collection of over 1 million items, including published and unpublished works, press cuttings, photographs, and eyewitness testimony. And so in this talk, as Ruth said, I'm going to firstly give an overview of the history of the library, because this is actually intertwined with the refugee story of the Wiener family. And I'll then bring this story up to the present day, just to give you a bit of an insight into the Wiener Library at 90 and our history. And then, of course, we'll get on to the refugee family stories in the collections, where I'll overview 5 different refugee stories through their personal papers and photographs. And they're all going to be based kind of around Camden or have been in Camden at a certain time. And finally, after this, I'm going to introduce you to the refugee map. This is a digital resource that we have that you can use to find out more about our collections and even the family stories that I've included here today. And then at the end, I'll save time for questions as well, whether it's about the family stories, our collections, or the library more generally. So feel free to keep them in your mind until the end. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to give a bit of an overview of when and why the library was founded. So our founder, who you can see on the left, was Dr. Alfred Wiener, who was born in 1885 in Potsdam and actually held a PhD in medieval Arabic literature. He fought in the First World War and won an Iron Cross for brave service for Germany. Post the First World War, Wiener was very foresighted in recognising a rise in anti-Semitism in Germany, and he actually became one of the top officials of an organisation called the Central Variant, or the CV, and this basically began documenting anti-Semitic activities in the late 1920s. Wiener himself also identified the specific threat of the Nazis and wrote a critique of Mein Kampf in 1925. So, in essence, he was taking the Nazis more seriously than most people were at that time and was just very foresighted in recognising this. And then, when Hitler came to power in 1933, Wiener decided to move to Amsterdam. Here, he founded the Jewish Central Information Office, or the JCIO, that you can see on the screen, which is essentially our predecessor organisation, and it did a really similar job to the CV in collecting and disseminating information relating to the persecution of Jews in Germany and in Europe as well. And on the screen, you can see the founding staff members of the JCIO. And on the far left, you've got Dr. Margareta Wiener, his wife, and then Alfred with the hat on. Well, sorry, they've all got hats on, but on the left as well. Yeah, again, following Kristallnacht in 1938, Wiener foresaw that actually Holland wasn't going to be safe for much longer. And so this is when he shipped the JCIO's collections to London, and that's kind of where it became known as the Wiener Library. So it came over for safety really before the war. He also attempted to gain visas for himself and his family at this time. He'd married, as I said, Dr. Margareta, who was also an academic and had been trained as an economist. The couple had 4 children, Carl, Ruth, Eva, and Miriam. But unfortunately, Carl died in 1928, aged just 6 from appendicitis. But here we've got pictures of the 3 girls who did survive. And actually, at this time, Wiener himself managed to get to the UK, but unfortunately, the visas for his wife and children did not arrive in time, and actually, they ended up spending time in concentration camps. So they were in Westerbork and Bergen-Belsen. Now, extraordinarily, it was agreed that the family could be released on a prisoner swap between the US and Germany, meaning that his daughters survived the camp, but unfortunately, en route to freedom, his wife Margareta passed away. And she was just very ill after the harsh conditions. And actually, we have her diary in the collection, and she actually states that she essentially starved herself to feed her daughters. And there's a bit of light in it that I think she knew that they were going to freedom, but for her it was just too late. And Alfred Wiener, who had spent the war years setting up the library in London, but also helping the British war effort, was unfortunately informed of his wife Margaretha Wiener's death, and subsequently their children's survival by telegram in 1945. And then 2 years later, in 1947, his three daughters, Ruth, Eva, and Miriam, left the US and rejoined their father in Golders Green in North London, where he'd settled. And that's a photograph of him on the right. Now, whilst in London, Wiener's collection was actually transferred to Manchester Square in London, I guess if you know where the Wallace collection is, just around there in Soho, in 1939. And Wiener actually made the resources available to the British government, intelligence departments, and the BBC over the course of the war. Then after the war, the library also provided material to the United Nations War Crimes Commission, or the Nuremberg trials, and actually gave assistance in the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the most important architects of the Holocaust. And in exchange for doing so, the library was given a large sum of original documentation used in evidence at the trials, and that's still in the archive today. And you can see an example of that on the left. So in London, as I said, that's kind of where the organisation became known as Dr. Wiener's Library. And actually, by 1958, the Wiener Library then settled into its new home in Devonshire Street. And then in 2011, as Ruth actually said, we moved to our current site in Russell Square. So if you kind of been recently to the British Museum or the British Library, we're just kind of parked in the middle of them both. And today, as I've briefly mentioned at the start, the collection is among the largest and most respected in the world and continues to grow, really. We offer an educational programme, exhibitions, and regular talks as well. And just to kind of bring you up to the present day, overall 2024 has already been quite a big year for the library. We celebrated our 90th anniversary. I've expanded our outreach programme, and just to name one, we've hosted a really interesting exhibition titled Genocidal Captivity, which actually focused on Yazidi and Armenian women and brought in really new and diverse audiences. So we don't have a permanent exhibition. It is temporary, mostly thematic exhibitions. It can be the Holocaust or Nazi persecution, or it can also be about different genocides that kind of testify in our collection. And equally, our educational and outreach team offer a variety of tours and workshops. And already this year, our team have seen nearly 1,500 students, community groups, and public members for tours and workshops. And yeah, so that just gives you a bit of an overview of our history, who we are, and what we do today as well. And now I'm going to get on with the kind of bulk of the talk, which will be about Camden Refugee Stories. And just before we do get into it, just to give some historical background to the era we're talking about and the conditions in which led many of the refugees I'm going to talk about to flee Nazism, here are just a very, very quick overview of the key events. So by April 1933, we have an economic boycott of Jewish businesses. That same month, you have Jews being removed from the civil service in Germany. 2 years later, as many of you will know, the Nuremberg laws were introduced, which removed citizenship from Jews and their Jewish status was defined. In November 1938, it was the November pogrom or Kristallnacht. And as part of this, we saw the mass arrests of Jewish men. And then in 1940, you have Jews in Poland moved into ghettos. And by the next year, you have all Jews in Germany required to wear a Star of David. In December of that year, the first extermination camp was established. And in 1942, in January, the Wannsee Conference was agreed with a plan for systematic genocide of the Jews of Europe. That's just a kind of bit of a contextual overview before we begin. And so now the first refugee family story I'm going to share is that of the Finkler family. And Walter Finkler was born in 1902. You can see him on the left of each photo, in Vienna, where he studied at both a music academy and also at a medical institute. And Hansi was born in 1906 and they married in 1927. So this is them on the screen. Their daughter Evelyn was then born in 1930, 3 years before Hitler came to power. And these are really beautiful photographs from their collection, dated in 1931 of Hansi and Evelyn. Now, as persecution of Jews in Europe increased, their daughter Evelyn had come to England in 1938, where she actually stayed at the Haven Hostel in Camden Town, which was a home for Jewish refugee children from Europe and was sponsored by the Lyons family. By September 1939, approximately nearly 300,000 Jews had emigrated from Germany, and around 117,000 had emigrated from Austria as well. Evelyn's mother, Hansi, who you can see on the right, emigrated from Austria to England in early March 1939 on a domestic service visa. More than 20,000 Jewish refugees, mostly women, came to Britain on visas granted for domestic service. The British government's policy was opportunistic. It aimed to fill a gap in the labour force, whilst also recognising that the women, who were often middle class and had no formal training, would likely not remain in these positions. And actually, Hansi had several jobs as a maid or cook in various parts of the country. But in the 1940s, she reunited with her daughter and they lived in a bedsit in Camden where they did kind of piecework to make ends meet. In the meantime, Walter was still trying to emigrate. And actually, this is a letter from Walter to his family regarding last preparations before emigration. And it's dated the 16th of March, 1939. And actually, you can see on the screen on the right, he's drawn his wife and his daughter at the bottom. But it really, really clearly shows his kind of concerns about being interned in a camp at the top. And you can see them kind of pointing there. Finally, Walter did arrive in England in the end of March in 1939, where he actually spent about a year in the Kitchener camp for refugees. And I'm not sure if many of you have heard of this, because quite interestingly, the Kitchener camp has been largely forgotten today. But in 1939, this derelict army base on the Kent coast became the scene of an extraordinary rescue, which I think it was about 4,000 men were saved from the Holocaust. Most of whom came directly from imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps. And this kind of internment camp was really a place where a supportive community flourished. The camp actually had its own post office, school, cinema, it had newspapers and an orchestra, and the inhabitants were really kept busy with a range of activities. And you can see a photograph of everyone kind of looking quite happy on the right there. And actually, Walter was actively involved in the Kitchener camp orchestra. And then on the left, this is again from his collection. It's Walter Finkler's visa, which granted him permission to land in England and is stamped by the Kent County Constabulary in 1939, if you can just see that on the top left. And as Walter was in the on the Kitchener camp, Hansi continued to work as a domestic servant in London and tried to secure her husband's release and reunite with their daughter Evelyn. And again, this document on the left is from the Central Office for Refugees. And I'm just going to read what it says. So it says, "Dear Mrs. Finkler, we thank you for your letter, contents of which we have noted. We beg to inform you that no decision has come with regard to women whose husbands are still in internment. It's only those whose husbands have already left for Australia who are being considered at the moment by the government. We would advise you to be patient and not nervous. Further news will be sent to you as soon as there are any decisions made. With regard to your daughter and mother, we would suggest that you get in touch with the committee who is responsible for them. Yours very truly on the behalf of the Domestic Bureau." Now, eventually, in 1940, after his internment, Walter was reunited with Hansi and his daughter Evelyn in London. And in 1946, Walter actually trained as a food scientist in Manchester. And then Walter, Hansi, and Evelyn actually lived there until 1954, after which the family then moved south again. And again, so you've got a photograph of them all in 1945 on the left. And on the right is a letter from the Home Office regarding Walter's certificate of naturalisation, which was issued in 1948. And I'll just give everyone a moment just have a look at that and have a read. All right, and that's just a very quick overview of the Finkler family, who, as I said, then did end up settling back down here. And now the next story I'm going to highlight is that of Lily Freeman, who was born in 1920, again to a Jewish family in Vienna. Escaping from the Gestapo at 18 years old, Lily actually then fled Austria to Amsterdam, and she lived there until the Nazi invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. And here on the left we have a birth certificate, which, as you can see, was not in the best condition when it came to the archive and was kind of taped together. But it's a really, really beautiful document. And then on the right is an identity document issued by the Netherlands. You can see a photograph of her on in the middle. Now, between 1933 and 41, as you'll know, many Jews decided to emigrate from the Third Reich in response to increasing Nazi persecution. And actually, by 1939, as I already said, you've had around 300,000 Jews emigrating from Germany. And Lily was one of these. So she herself managed to secure a place on a boat with other refugees for Liverpool. And upon arrival, she actually was then sent down south and was interned as an enemy alien. And she spent a month in Holloway prison and then a year on the Isle of Man. After her release in 1942, Lily moved to London and she lived in Camden near Hendon Way. And actually, you can, oh, sorry. And in 1944, she then married Karl Friedman, who was also a refugee from Vienna. And actually, yeah, you can see that this is a marriage certificate on the left. And you can see that was in Hampstead. And on the right is one of her identity cards. Now, later, Lily enrolled at the Arthur Segal School in Hampstead to study art, and she continued her studies with a degree from the Open University too. Despite the fact that refugees were granted entry on a temporary basis, with the expectation that they would actually move on in due course, some 40,000 stayed and made their homes in Britain after the war. Lily was one of these, and she became an artist. And in her 40s, she lectured in fine art at the University of the Third Age for many years. And actually, she lived in Camden until she passed away in 2016. And before I move on to the next story, I'm just going to give again a moment just to have a little look at the newspaper clippings on the screen um, from her work. Okay, so now moving on. Ernst Mitchell was born in Breslau in 1909. His father, Julius, was a synagogue cantor from Poland, and his mother, Rosa, was a German teacher. He studied dentistry and became a dental mechanic. And in September 1937, he moved to Berlin to train at a laboratory. And he was very active in the anthroposophical community. Now, his older sister, Edith, moved to the UK by 1939 on a domestic servant visa, so similar to some of the stories I've already spoken about. And this is actually a Red Cross telegram she sent to Ernst. You might have seen these before. We have many examples of Red Cross telegrams in the collection. They're really fragile items that were sometimes the only contact that families separated by the war had. And because of this, they really formed a vital line of connection. After the war started, it was impossible to post letters or other items directly to Germany and other enemy states or German occupied states. And so the Red Cross facilitated the transmission of these telegrams by posting them via neutral countries such as Portugal or Switzerland. And from there, they could then be posted on into an enemy territory. Now, the telegrams had to be no more than around 25 words in length, and they were supposed to be about so-called uncontroversial topics. And as I was kind of saying with the stamps before, you can see the journeys of them usually. So you've got that it was passed in Britain at the top, and then you can see the Red Cross stamp, and it should be on either side as well. And so on the left, this is the front side of the telegram. And this is, like I said, from his sister. And it reads, "Beloved all, I think about you daily. No message for a long time." And then on the back, Ernst responds saying, vaguely kind of, "We are healthy. Hans twice sent you packages and your husband offered us help. Constantly thinking of you. Heartfelt wishes for your parents." And now, actually, not long after this, Ernst was deported from Berlin in 1942. From the ghetto in Riga, Ernst was actually taken to Kaiserwald concentration camp and works in a dental laboratory outside the camp. When the Russian army came nearer in 1944, the prisoners were moved to Stutthof. And in 1944, as the Russian army came nearer, Ernst was taken. Oh, sorry, I repeated that already. And he actually worked in Stutthof camp in a shipbuilding yard. And then the camp was liberated by the Russian army in 1945. And I'm just going to show an excerpt from his AGR interview from 2003, where he kind of talks about his time there. I'm just going to move screens. Sorry, give me a moment. Let's hope everyone can see that on the screen.
Yes, you were talking about the liberation. So you were in Stutthof, in a side camp of Stutthof. And what happened?
We worked in a shipbuilding yard called Chichau, where the sailor, or what was his name? The Polish started the uprising in Poland. The sailor, so similar, doesn't matter. There we worked in the shipbuilding yard. And that was an outside camp of Stutthof.
Yes.
We were not more than, that's 800 men there, 600 or 800 men.
And you said you were liberated by the Russians.
No.
How do you remember liberation? How do you remember the liberation?
I was what they called in our language a Muselman. That means one who couldn't die yet. You know, one of those skeletons who hung between heaven and earth, wasn't quite dead yet. And again, by one of the miracles, I was allowed to be ill. Otherwise, people who were ill were killed or sent to the ovens. And I, again, one of the many miracles was that officially I was allowed to be ill, certificated. And there, the Russians came one day. I was lying there on that cot, half dead, and they had a Russian screaming. Unbelievable. There was Easter 45. Wait a minute, 45. And another miracle was, although I was the enemy alien as a German Jew, they took me into the Russian army hospital and nursed me back to life.
And then Ernst picked up on this a little bit, but after liberation by the Russian army in 1945, he then went back to Berlin, where he lived at a UNRWA camp. He then emigrated to the UK in 1948 and joined his half-sister Edith, and he actually managed to secure a permit as a dental mechanic. He attended events ran by the International Friendship League, and this is where he met his wife Marjorie, who was a lecturer, and they actually lived together in Hampstead, which is where they settled. All right, so moving on. So Anna Klein was born in Els in Lower Silesia in 1919. And her father's family were originally from Latvia, and her grandfather, who was a shoemaker, came to Pomerania where her father was born. He was one of 11 children, and her mother was from Eastern Prussia. Her father then served in the army in the First World War, and as a dispatch rider and head of artillery, he also won the Iron Cross, which he later displayed in his shoe shop in Earls. The shop employed a number of staff, making and selling, and was situated in the main street. Anna went to the local school where she had a happy childhood, and she and her parents had non-Jewish friends, but she was the only Jewish child at school. The family attended the only Jewish synagogue in their small community. Now, with the rise of Nazism, everything changed. Her friends distanced themselves, and she was asked to leave school in 1935. Only one teacher spoke up for her, at risk to herself. Her father's shops were daubed with slogans and suffered boycotts. And Anna actually briefly attended a Jewish school in Breslau, where she took her exams. Anna actually wanted to go to Palestine, but her parents sent her to train as a children's nurse in Geneva instead. They would work very hard from 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. and with lectures afterwards. And she received about half a day off a fortnight. And actually in some of her recollections, she remembers that the matron was very anti-Semitic as well. She was then sent on placements to France and actually was made to smuggle money over the border. In 1938, she finished her training, but was unfortunately not allowed to work in Switzerland. Instead, amazingly, she found a job as a maternity nurse for a family of a lawyer in Algeria, and she worked there for a year. Her parents managed to get a permit to London for her through a relation in 1939, and she hoped to join them, but again, her passport had run out and when the war broke out. And so she was working for this family at the time, but was then given the sack. She was alone with no one to turn to and no work permit. Again, in her recollections, she says that she packed oranges for a while and then was asked to help the local midwife called Paula Ali. She then accompanied her and often delivered babies on her own. And she lived in a small hotel and paid her way by keeping the books. Erna was then actually interned in Sidi Bel Abbas, but was released after she became ill and then eventually returned again to work with Paulette. And these are photographs of her when she was a midwife. Now, when France fell to Germany, a German commission was established and they wanted to send her to Germany, but she was in hospital with appendicitis and could not be moved. She was then actually interned a second time in the Atlas Mountains. After release, she worked for different doctors as a midwife. She met and helped people from the smallest villages to the important sheikhs. And again, she was interned a third time by the Americans, but through the help of a cousin in the American army, she was actually released and managed to come to England in December 1945. And she said she was really overwhelmed at being reunited with her parents. And I'm just going to show you a bit of a clip from one of her interviews, although I'll try and make the move a little bit faster than I did in the last one, so I'll see how I can do. There we go.
That was in Algiers in 1938. Anna Dannemann, was there with the baby. I went over to look after. I went over to Algeria to look after. I had to leave, despite the fact that I was sent by the pouponnière to mothers who just had their babies and stayed with them for a few weeks, or as a kind of maternity nurse, plus looking after newly born children. And for all the stages I worked for, the pouponnière received my salary. But once I had finished my training and would have liked to stay in Switzerland to work on my own behalf, and I wasn't allowed to do so. But they did offer me two different places, one in Bulgaria and one in Algeria. And I chose to go to Algeria. And that was to go to a Jewish family. The husband was conseiller general. He was a councillor for the town of Algiers. And they were expecting their second baby. And I was supposed to look after the baby from day one.
Do you remember the journey to Algeria?
Yes, I went by train to Marseille, and I had to stay the night in Marseille, and then I crossed with a boat called La Ville d'Alger. We passed the Balearic Islands, and I think the Spanish Civil War must still have been on, because we were shot at from the islands. They shot cannonballs at us, but we were not hit. We arrived in Alger quite safely. Yes.
What month was this? Do you remember when in 1938?
In summer. I think it was July, but I'm not.
And well, what happened on your arrival? How did you get on when you arrived?
Well, the Monsieur Belaïch, it was my employer, the husband of my employer, waited for me at the harbor, and he took me home. And I met his family, which consisted of his wife and little daughter. The baby had not been born then, I believe. And his parents lived in the same very large flat. It was all very confusing because of the difficulty of the language, but also there was suddenly people of very many different nationalities
Yeah, so as I said, so Anna then came over to England in 1945, and actually she retrained then as a midwife here for 2 years, and then was again sent on various placements. So she had quite a hectic life until this time. And actually 1 week before her finals in 1948, she married a refugee from Berlin, Friedrich Klein, and you can see the photograph here. And then who went to work in his business in London. And actually they finally married and belonged to Belsize Park Synagogue, where they settled as well. And then the final Camden refugee story I'm going to overview is that of John Robertson, who was born Hans Meyer. And he was born in 1923 to a Catholic father, Friedrich Meyer, and a Jewish mother, Hilda, who had met as students in Munich. And they were actually communist intellectuals. And you can see the family photograph on the right and a picture of John on the left. Now, his mother Hilda worked for the Comintern in Berlin, and she actually had to leave Berlin in 1933 for political reasons and took the family initially to Amsterdam. Hilda then took her children to Paris, where she managed an orphanage. In the meantime, she'd been separated from her husband, Friedrich, who subsequently actually remarried an Argentinian and had 2 further children. Luckily, though, John was sent to Britain in 1938, and his mother and sister came later. His mother then entered a marriage of convenience with Dale Robertson, who was the son of the family which hosted them in Highbury. And this resulted in British passports, which enabled her to continue her residence in Great Britain. And actually, this is a letter John sent to his father at this time. And you can see at the top left that his address is in West End Lane in NW6. And he's telling his father that actually he doesn't know if he'll be able to visit Paris for Pentecost due to waiting for his passport and resident permit in the UK. Now, again, quite similar to some of the other stories I've mentioned today, but in 1914, John was then interned on the Isle of Man as an enemy alien for several months. During the Second World War, the British government interned several different groups of people, including German, Austrian, and Italian nationals. And often internment was really stressful and confusing for those affected. And arrests were conducted by the police and usually took place in the morning. So people were not told where they were going or how long they'd be detained for. Many were held for short periods of time in poorly equipped temporary holding camps, often without food. Although most internees were released within a year of being detained, and actually initially releases were uncommon though. However, as the year drew to the close, so by the end of 1940, the rate of release increased dramatically, and actually by the end of 1940, approximately 10,000 people had been freed. And actually, after his release from internment, John joined an organisation called the British Farmers, British Boys to help the war effort. Here, he became determined to join the British Army and enlisted in the Pioneer Corps in 1941. This is actually when he changed his name from Hans Meyer to John Robertson. John then served as a private in the Pioneer Corps. Then, sorry, I've said that. Then served with the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry in Britain and Northwest Europe from 1943 to 1945. And actually, between 45 and 46, he also served as an interpreter with Claims and Hiring Commission in Germany as well. And then after the war, John trained as a barrister and taught business law. And actually, again, you can kind of see his alien identity card, which is dated to Fellows Road in NW3 and stamped in 1946. Then you've got a photograph of him on the left in Munich after the war. And so that kind of brings us to the end of the refugee families. And I hope that has brought some of the stories in our collection to life, and that you've got a bit of an overview of the types of stories and materials that we have in the collection. And actually, before I end the presentation, it's worth noting that these stories are drawn from our refugee map. And this is just a really, really incredible resource where it traces refugees' journeys with individual records related to a specific location and period within their travels. So you can see on the right, it's kind of got pinned stories on the map. And then the refugee stories are accompanied by unique documents from the library's archive. And this includes, diaries, photographs, emigration papers, Red Cross letters, all the types of things that I've told the stories through today. And yeah, they really reveal and preserve the stories of the individuals and families that fled Nazi anti-Semitism and persecution in the years before, during, and after the Second World War. And as I've noted, these collections contain loads of different types of materials that just preserve different stories, whether it's a kind of British one, whether it's about the kinder transport, and you can search by theme as well. But for instance, there's documents and letters that you'll have seen quite a few of today. Memoirs and testimony. So we hold the interviews that you watched before from the AGR, but we had those at the library. So if anyone ever wants to come in and have a listen, you're more than welcome. But also written testimony as well. Audiovisual, sorry, which links into the testimony too. And actually, you can see Anna's on the right there. Photographs, which I think is my favourite. I think they're a really personal way of talking about the history of the Holocaust and refugee stories. Artwork and illustrations and news clippings as well. And actually, our current exhibition is on a man called Fred Cormiss, who was a sculptor. And actually, this is his work, the painting or drawing on the right with the man. And that's actually currently on show in our upcoming exhibition. So if you'd like to see more kind of about refugee artwork and how it links to the history of the 20th century and their stories, that's what's on at the moment too. And yeah, so the link is just there if you'd like it. And now I think I'm just going to stop sharing the screen. Oh, sorry, actually, I included an extra slide just in case anyone was interested. Ruth actually mentioned she came to visit the library on our last open house, and actually this Saturday we are taking part in the open house festival again. I think we're actually not on the Camden weekend because unfortunately our exhibition wasn't open in time, but this Saturday will be open 12 till 4 p.m. and we're not usually open on a weekend, so if you're interested in coming to have a look, I do pop in. And then there's just some examples of some other book talks we have. So if you want to find out more about them, I can email Ruth over the links at the end. But yes, I've just saved some time for some Q&A. And again, I've just put a feedback form on there if you have any comments or questions. You can also ask on there if you'd like to. But I'll just stop sharing the screen. And if you do have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Yasmin. I'm not sure how well I'm going to be able to deal with this. I've got some we've had problems with the connectivity with our computer. So I hope you can hear
Just about a little bit, I'm not.
And anyway, thank you very much, Yasmin, for a very fascinating.
I think we lost Ruth.
I think Ruth's frozen. I think what she wanted to say was thank you very much for a very fascinating talk. And it was absolutely fabulous. I actually have a question of my own, but before that, I just wondered whether anybody else who's brave enough to put their video back on would like to ask a question. Are there any there? Just raise a hand. Peter Marsh, if you could unmute yourself and just ask, that's great.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. It's very interesting. This business of getting a visa, what were the criteria to do that? And how do you have any idea how people managed it and what they had to do to actually get that visa to come over? And by the way, I put in the question box, it seemed to me once you got a visa, then being interred was notably tough, you know, but you'd have thought the visa might have been a legal guarantee. Anyway,
That would be too
what
easy.
was the visa process then?
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, thanks for your question. Suppose I'm not completely sure. I know for the most part, it was more case by case and really specific to the type of person. So a lot of children visas were given for children who came on the kinder transport, for instance, and that was much quicker and much easier, particularly because the government wanted to look like they were kind of doing something but didn't have to put much money behind it. I'm not completely sure with the other visas. A lot of the time it was if kind of similar to today, if they had a family connection and someone could sponsor them, it'd be much easier. And then with your second question, with obviously they then gone through the hardship of getting that visa, come over and then are quite likely to be interned. Honestly,
Right.
to do with the
Caroline.
oh sorry. Oh, to do with intelligence, you know, real skepticism of who was coming over. So particularly, I mean, it was most common for men over the age of 40, but pretty much anyone German speaking who was coming over at that time was met with such skepticism and worry and concern about intelligence and the war that actually they kept them on interned until they thought actually, okay, it's all right now, they can be let in.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we've got two questions from two Carolines. First of all, Caroline Moore, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, please. My question is about disabled access. I used to come to your exhibitions and I used to love coming to, I mean, love is maybe the wrong word because some of them are quite traumatic exhibitions. I mean, really, really penetrating and with lots of amazing information, some of which I had no idea.
That's frozen again.
But my question is about disabled access because I used to be able to stagger up the steps.
Yeah.
And I just recently found that there was something that looked like, I live really nearby. I thought there was something that looked like a lift, but I'm not sure whether it actually gives full step-free access. And how do you get into the lift if you're allowed? Because it seemed to be like a bit locked up or everything. I mean, how do you get through is my question.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, and I'm really sorry that you had that experience if you weren't able to kind of properly get in very easily. But we do have step-free access. However, the outside lift, the external lift was kind of out of order for, I want to say, 3 weeks over the summer. So I don't know if it was that you came at that time. I don't know, when did you come, Caroline?
I didn't know that there was a lift because I've only recently noticed there was a lift. I've kind of gone by.
Yeah, we have
and I've not seen the placards. We've not had any placards out recently. I thought, well, there's no placards, no exhibition.
I can write that down and make sure we get that in because I don't think we do have a placard actually. But no,
the way to sort of like lure you in, which I was happy to be lured in, but then I noticed that there was a lift, and I thought, really, is this going to lead to step free? Because I thought maybe there's another step beyond.
No,
how do you get into it? It's because
so there's an external lift which basically it's kind of you do need someone else to assist you. So someone from the library would come out and press the button to lift it up from the external lift, and then we have internal lift access throughout as well. But actually, again, this sounds like it happens a lot. Actually, it's never happened. But our internal lift has literally broke down today, but it should be fixed by Monday. So if you come anytime after next week,
how do you get the lift though? I couldn't understand what to do because I said it and I thought, what do I get a passerby to beat on the door or what?
Yeah, so usually we have a security guard that stands right by the front entrance, and so he kind of keeps an eye, and if you kind of come up, he would come out and press it from the upstairs to lift you up.
Okay, fine. So what you're telling me is I can get in if I behave well and so on. Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, if you like, Caroline, as well, I can give my email and you're more welcome to get in touch with me, and I can try and arrange a visit that we can make sure that that's in place and help you.
But I think it's for other people as well. Other people could, because like I was lured in when I could go up the steps, and I think like there's 17% of the UK population is disabled. So you're missing out on a huge number of people who might be keen to come and have a look,
Step-free access, though, it is completely step-free.
I'd like to say that my mother's cousin, when he came here, he was only 17 and he was sent straight to the Isle of Man, along with my grandmother, who was in her 70s. First of all, she was sent to Holloway, and then she was sent to the Isle of Man. And yes, my cousin used to tell me a lot about it. They had to fill their own mattresses with straw, and they were pretty rough conditions. And there are a lot of interesting people there. I mean, including musicians from the Amadeus Quartet.
I'm still waiting for Caroline Barron to ask a question as well.
Don't worry.
So
what's happened?
So a lot of people actually found it quite stimulating and intellectually stimulating there. It was a horrible situation, but they all made the best of it. Yeah, but the British government was absolutely terrified of what they called the fifth column, which was potential spies. There was a lot of spying going on, and of course they didn't know who was and who wasn't, so they just chucked everybody in together. Yes. And it's very difficult to get here as a refugee. The situation was somewhat similar to the one now. Even if you did have a visa, you had to have someone to sponsor you. And when you got here, you weren't allowed to work. My father was a doctor in Germany. His qualifications were never recognized. He had to go back to university all over again and study. Yeah. So the situation actually hasn't moved on very much. It's rather similar now.
Thank you. I completely agree.
Okay, now Caroline Barron, would you like to ask your question, Caroline?
Yes,
our
I
president.
would. Firstly, to thank Yasmin for that really fascinating talk. And what makes you realize that people who, as it were, look very much like yourself or your parents have these very complex back histories, really amazing back histories, but they kind of blend into the world as we know it now. So that's one thing. Just to say,
well, a lot of them are dead.
Well, yeah, okay. I'm thinking about my parents and their generation. I think also I had a friend at college who had come. Now she was actually Czech, but she was not Jewish. But when her family chose to come to England after the war for complex reasons, and her father who'd been a bank manager in Prague, had to work as an agricultural laborer for 5 years or something, and her mother had to work as a domestic servant of some sort.
Yeah, that was prevalent.
So that was the conditions on which they were able to settle in England. But, her father ultimately became an accountant and her mother taught in the local primary school, and both their daughters went to Oxford University. So that says something for the way they were, their perseverance and their determination, but also the community that accepted them and let them flourish. I just wanted to
Sorry, one of the most help that was given was provided by the Quakers, not the British Jews. It was by the Quakers. They were fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's true. I wanted to ask Yasmin, though, whether anything in your records throws any light on that film that many of us will have seen, One Life, about, the bringing the Czech Kindertransport out. Do you have anything that related to that?
I'm going to double check because I know we do, but I actually can't remember for the life of me what the specific. I think we have a list of the names in the collection. But let me just, because what I could do, I can have a quick look on the catalogue and actually just send it into the chat in case anyone else.
That was a very interesting film, I thought, about how one person could make quite a difference if they were determined.
Yeah, so we've got, let me have a little look. I think we also have, so we have some personal papers of a child that was brought over by Nicholas Winton rather than necessarily the names, and some of the Kinder memoirs as well. So that's kind of, I'll just put that in the chat. I think you should be able to see what comes up. But yeah, that was really beautiful.
Yes, that's a remarkable film, and how one person felt he hadn't done enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can see as well.
Can I ask a question as well?
Yeah.
To what extent, it seems that these stories would have come thick and fast at one point and then started to slow. To what extent is there a little bit of a race on to make sure you've got the last of those stories before no one remembers? And how do you make sure you're not going to lose any of that narrative?
That is pretty, yeah, thank you, Lindsay. Oh, well, so a lot of the work that the Wiener Holocaust Library team did after the war was to gather testimony and really go out and get them. And actually, as you'll know, the survivors we have now is so limited. But actually, we're really lucky that the second generation, even the third generation, are still really engaged. And actually, we still have families today coming to us and going, we didn't even know. We didn't even realise. And we found this suitcase in the attic. We found these letters. And they kind of come to us and want answers and want the story and want to find out what happened. And so it's difficult to say because, I mean, even last year, every I think we got 52 new family donations, so one a week of a new family collection added to the library. And we just try and do as much outreach and engagement as possible, whether it's with synagogue groups, whether it's with schools, just so they know that we're here and can share. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Lindsay, but we try and engage with the second generation as well because they're often able to tell the story when the first generation of the survivors found it too difficult.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you very much. I think that's certainly true, the way that how people maybe do or don't communicate about what they did in the war. For example, my father, he was in the army, obviously, and he used to talk quite a lot about the Normandy aspects of it, but he never ever told us about the fact that he was one of the people that went into Belsen.
Wow.
After it had been liberated, and it was such a horrible experience, and I know it had affected him quite many years after the event, and I didn't realize this until my mother told me this was long after he died, what had actually happened. And I said, I'm sure he was suffering from PTSD, and she wouldn't believe me, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. Caroline Moore, I think, wanting to say something else. Caroline, were you wanting to say something else?
My question is that so the link that you put in the chat, Yasmin, doesn't work because
it might be that I'm logged in.
You've got administrator access and we don't.
Let me have it.
And so what is the deal about? Can we look at the records?
Yeah, so you should be. I think sometimes if I'm logged in, it won't let you. Let me have a little look if this just goes to it.
I tried to look at them and it just told me, no, you do not have access to this. You're not an administrator. And I'm like, okay.
Oh, it may have been the
one. Does this one work? If someone can try. Yeah, sorry, I should have logged out.
Wienersutron.net. That's your library system, isn't it?
Yeah,
the general record.
So can we do an electronic look at the records?
Yeah, so you can look at not necessarily well, we actually have the full digital library with everything digitized. It's going to launch in January, but at the moment you can just search the catalogue, so you can at least see a list.
It's gone again.
And the kind of
this is still not letting I can't get in on my computer anyway to you. It's not telling me I don't have access anymore. It's just telling me.
I think sorry, because I'm on my
Don't worry, that's fine. So basically you're saying that we can look it up.
Yes, you can. And I can either send it you afterwards or I can very, very quickly try and find it.
This is something that we could actually add to the information we've got about the talk if necessary. That will be a good way of doing it. Yeah. If people are happy with that.
Yeah, definitely. Good idea.
That's my last try. I'm not going to try again, but that's the last try in the chat. If not, I'll send it afterwards. But that should just bring up the catalogue, and then you can search in Nicholas Winton or a certain location or person or story, and that should come up.
Okay, I think we've now finished. Thank you very much, Yasmin, for your time and your interesting enthusiasm about the subject, which is really quite a difficult one, really, isn't it? And absolutely amazed at the range of information that is available to tap into, and the fact that people can still actually contribute information to the library and to future history. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.